let's put India aside for the time being and talk about what you and I discussed at length in the previous podcast, the China-US relationship. How do things look from Beijing's perspective, including the last 4 years of Biden administration and the coming 4 years of Trump administration?
Again, it's very important to make a distinction between the structural changes and the short-term developments. Excuse me. Structurally, the relationship between U.S. and China is shifting. I mean, the Americans are obviously trying to stop China's development. They think to some extent they have done so. But if you take a 10-year time horizon, no way they're going to stop China. So the Chinese still feel confident that the long run, they'll be better off. The Chinese economy, as you know, is having some real short-term challenges. The next 2 to 3 years will be difficult. The real estate market is still in the dumps. Consumer sentiment is down. Business sentiment is down. So they're struggling to get their 5% growth rate. So over the next 2 to 3 years, Chinese economy is going to be struggling. But if you look at China decade by decade, at the end of each decade, they look so much stronger. And I gave already the statistic how their share of global manufacturing has gone from 5% in 2000 and will reach 45% in 2030. That's an example of how they look decade by decade. And certainly, if you ask yourself a very simple question, which leading economy in the world has invested the most in the industries of the future? I mean, no question is China. Yeah? EVs, solar panels, wind turbines, battery technology, robots, you go on, right? And if there's one economy that's really prepared for the future, preparing itself for the future, is China. And it's causing structural changes around the world. I mean, if you and I had had this interview 10 years ago, and I told you, Timur, 10 years ago, I told you in 2015, 10 years from now, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Audi, Toyota, Nissan, all will be so scared of Chinese automobiles.
I would have laughed at you.
You would have laughed at me. Everybody would have laughed. You must be joking. I remember as recently as 3-4 years ago, Elon Musk said, who the hell is going to buy a Chinese automobile? Look where we are today. All the companies I mentioned are shit scared of Chinese automobiles. So, this is, and just to mention an event that happened last few days, look at how much value NASDAQ has lost because of a company I never heard of called DeepSeek. Where did this Chinese company come from? And how does a hedge fund manager create a world-beating AI company? It doesn't make sense. So, therefore, what we have, the biggest lesson, and this is what I'm a friend of the United States. My goal is to help the United States adapt intelligently to the rise of the Chinese. And I always keep telling my American friends, it's very dangerous for you to underestimate China. It's safer for you to overestimate China. And to be fair to me, I've been saying this for 20, 30 years, consistently. And so with these structural changes happening, the rebalancing between US and China will continue. Now, over the short term, I think China is probably going to have a rough time initially with Donald Trump, because Donald Trump, as you know, only believes in working through threats and tariffs and so on and so forth. So there'll be some rockiness in the US-China relationship. But at the same time, if there's one man who can make a deal with China, a comprehensive deal with China, it is certainly Donald Trump. Joe Biden and his administration were so frightened of being seen to be soft on China They didn't dare to do even the obvious things they could have done to improve ties with China. Donald Trump has got the advantage. They say only Richard Nixon could go to China. Only Donald Trump can make a deal with China. And at some point in time, if they reach a deal of some kind and stabilize the U.S.-China relationship, that wouldn't be surprised either. So, and this means that all the other people around the world, like the Europeans, who were counting on an adversarial U.S.-China relationship, will suddenly find themselves marginalized. So this is the sort of thing that you got to be geopolitics is a very cruel business. You got to think very hard about how you could, on the one hand, enhance your position, and on the other hand, how your position could be seriously suffer if other changes happen.
Like, sure, the mercurial nature of Trump is really something else. To your point of the Biden administration being petrified of just being seen soft on China, they basically co-opted all the measures that Trump had put in place, and they intensified them, including the ban on TikTok. And then Trump comes back and he says, yeah, maybe we shouldn't ban it.
Yeah.
So what was the point of trying to look even holier than thou for the Biden administration? It didn't really amount to anything. But just staying it...
Just a quick point.
Sure.
The bigger problem with the Biden administration is that they didn't have long-term strategic thinkers in the administration. I can tell you that in my last one-on-one conversation with Henry Kissinger in October 2022, about a year before he died, he more or less suggested that, they're not thinking long-term and company. You with China, you got to ask yourself where you want to be 10 years, 20 years from now. Forget the next quarter. Forget the tariffs and all that. What is your end goal? And the Biden administration never specified what his end goal is going to be 10 years, 20 years down the road. And what has shocked me even more is that not a single member of the Biden administration consulted Henry Kissinger. And the least they could have done, at least, to show some courage, is allow Henry Kissinger to go back to China in 2021 to mark the 50th anniversary of the opening up with China. But they were so scared, they didn't even allow Kissinger to go to China.
Right.
So that's an example of cowardice that unfortunately plagued the Biden administration.
Yeah, I've looked at various speeches that Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken gave over the last 4 years. And I felt that it was a continuation of whatever they thought the Trump administration had done, that we got to be even tougher than that, a little wide yard and high fence and those sort of analogy. It was all about looking at China as an existential adversary, as opposed to looking at the gains from a win-win relationship of openness.
And the Biden administration especially, because it genuinely, the biggest compliment I can pay the Biden administration is that they understood that climate change was a real threat. And it is a real threat, come on. Now, if climate change is a real threat, and you really want to focus on saving planet Earth, then you've got to press the pause button on the geopolitical contest with China and tell China, hey, we are both two cabins on one boat. The boat is sinking. Let's work together. But the Biden administration, even though it realized that climate change is real, didn't have the courage to tell the American people, hey, we really got to save the planet. And the only way we can save the planet is if all of us come together, and we must bring China on board. That's a very simple, obvious thing the Biden administration could have said. But all they wanted to show is that they were tougher on China than the Trump administration. And it was a losing game.
I agree. Let's go back to the point you made about Xi Jinping's Davos speech about China, jumping into the rough waters of globalization and coming out stronger. If we assume that the narrative of fragmentation continues in the US and Europe, they see China as an adversary and they restrict market access, technology access, and so on. What is China's strategy vis-a-vis the other 85% of the world?
Well, I think the China strategy vis-a-vis the other 85% of the world started more than 10 years ago. With things like the Belt and Road Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, And, a Brazilian diplomat told me that in the year 2000, it took Brazil 1 year to to export $1 billion to China. Today, it takes Brazil 60 to 70 hours to export $1 billion to China. So, remember, Brazil is in theory in the American sphere of influence, and Brazil is covered by the Monroe Doctrine and so on and so forth. So here is a country that has developed extensive ties with China. It's not going to sacrifice its ties with China just because of the United States. So what the Chinese have done, therefore, vis-a-vis the 85%, is to enhance their substantive ties with these countries. And to give you another example, Indonesia, after Indonesia made a decision to build a fast train with China between Jakarta and Bandung, the Biden administration sent a team and said, be careful, be careful. And the Indonesian response was, okay, why don't you, America, come and build a fast train in Indonesia? They'll be happy if you did so. But, again, the U.S. couldn't compete with China on that. So I think, therefore, the Chinese have had, as I explained in my book, Has China Won?, a consistent long-term strategy on how to manage pressures from China, from the United States on China. And the best way to do so is to ensure that the rest of the world has a vested interest in not cutting off China. That's a strategic decision they made ages ago. And you see this in ASEAN. For example, in the year 2000, China-ASEAN trade was only $40 billion US. In 2022, it hit $975 billion, almost $1 trillion. So all this interdependency between China and the rest of the world mean that China has preemptively killed any containment strategy by the United States. And see, by contrast, the United States doesn't have a long-term policy that can counterbalance China. And actually, what the United States has now with the Trump administration is the exact opposite, because Trump is actually, in one way or another, going to alienate a lot of countries in the world. I'm sure Canada is mad as hell. I'm sure Mexico is mad as hell. Colombia, I'm sure, is now mad as hell, even though it kowtowed in the end. When people have to kowtow, they get mad.
Of course.
Ironically, if Trump goes systematically threatening country by country systematically, including friends like Japan and South Korea, then frankly, Trump could be a real gift to China that keeps on giving.
But in terms of China, so nobody contests the fact that China has deepened economic symbiosis with vast parts of the global South. But is it doing the prudent thing in South China Sea, for example? We see Philippines, China friction, sometimes Vietnam, China friction. And of course, we have the Taiwan, Korea, Japan situation vis-a-vis China as well. So what's your assessment of China's sort of the wolf warrior past, or is it sort of being a little more pragmatic in dealing with its immediate neighbors?
Well, I mean, the key point I always emphasize about when you deal with great powers, always remember that the phrase benevolent great power is an oxymoron. No great power is benevolent. I mean, United States was in some ways benevolent after World War II and so on and so forth with the Marshall Plan and all that. But as you can see, in the long run, every great power will put its interests first and sacrifice others. As you know, the Europeans are terrified of being abandoned in Ukraine now. So in the same way, China is also not a benevolent great power. It has to put its own interests first. And there's no question that as China becomes more and more powerful, it is going to become more and more assertive. I mean, if I give a simple analogy, if you and I are having this conversation for an hour, we started off by having a cat in the room sitting in the corner. You and I will be talking very comfortably. What's a lovely cat? You can look at it. But after an hour, suddenly the cat becomes a tiger. I think you and I would sit here very uncomfortably looking at the tiger, So China, to put it simply, I mean, mathematically this is true, has gone from being a cat to becoming a tiger, right? Look at how much the economy has exploded. And so you can no longer assume that the China that behaved like a cat is going to continue behaving like a cat when it becomes a tiger. That's so unrealistic. It's going to become more assertive. But at the same time, there's a huge difference between two English words. One is assertive and the other is aggressive. So China can become more assertive without necessarily becoming aggressive. Now, you mentioned the South China Sea. Just go and read Graham Allison's book, Destined for War on U.S.-China Relations, where he says, Americans keep wishing, why can't China be like us? He said Americans should stop wishing that China be like us, because China today, in the 2020s, is where United States was in the 1890s. And the president then, by the way, was McKinley,
Yes.
whom Trump reveres. What did he do? Once you got the muscles, you declare war on Spain. You seize Philippines, you seize Puerto Rico, you seize Guam, you seize Cuba, and so on and so forth. I mean, that's what great powers do. Now, I can tell you this, there are lots of features in the South China Sea. If tomorrow China decided that it should occupy all of them, it could do so in 24 hours. Everyone knows that. No question whatsoever. And the question, therefore, is why hasn't China done that on the South China Sea? And here, when you look at all the discussions on the South China Sea, in theory, the problems are within China and the 4 ASEAN countries, Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Brunei. All the discussion of South China Sea is in the Anglo-Saxon media. The South China Sea, the ASEAN countries are keeping very quiet because they know they have to, in some ways or another, get along and work with China and find adjustments with them. And it doesn't mean that they kowtow to China, but they also know that you got to stand up with China, which Vietnam is doing all the time, but you don't have to do so publicly, right? And the problem with the Philippines is that you notice that when you deal with a rising power as a neighbor, the most important thing every country in Southeast Asia should have is a consistent long-term policy in managing your big neighbor. When you vacillate, you create confusion and uncertainty. And the Philippines has gone from Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, pro-China, to Aquino, pro-US, to Duterte, pro-China, to now Marcos, pro-US. Now that inconsistency becomes a challenge in geopolitics. You know, you're creating unnecessary problems. So I've told my Filipino friends, sit down and work out a consistent long-term policy on China where you defend your interests, but make it bipartisan and stick to it over the long term. And don't flip and switch every 4 to 5 years because it's not healthy. At the end of the day, Philippines has got to find a way of living with your big neighbor. And the rule of history is that if you have a big neighbor, you adjust to the big neighbor, and the big neighbor doesn't adjust to you. By the way, just to confirm this, a good friend of mine was a champion sailor, and she says when you're on a sailboat and you see a big boat, right? Even if in theory you have the right of way and the big boat has to give way, there's something called the big boat rules. The big boat rules. You move aside. Because if you ram into the big boat carries on and your yacht is sunk.
Yes.
So, so it's a reality of life. And to pretend that you can deal with a power that is so much more powerful as an equal is a very dangerous geopolitical illusion. No, it doesn't mean, I want to emphasize, it doesn't mean you kowtow, give way, and so on and so forth. But you manage the great power in such an intelligent way, you persuade them that it's in their interest to work with you and that you're not hostile to them. And yet at the same time, you tell them very clearly, these are my core interests and please don't touch them.
I experienced the rule of big boats recently. I was canoeing from Pulau Ubin back to Singapore. When the big tugboats come, it doesn't matter whether you have the right of way, you get out of their way because they cannot stop for you.
Yeah.
But Kishore, I want to stay with the tiger analogy for a second. U.S. has been a big tiger in the global neighborhood for a century or so. U.S. soft power has been so powerful in keeping the rest of the world at ease with the U.S. Recent experience notwithstanding, Hollywood, books, U.S. companies and their brands. So isn't it in China's interest to project soft power in a more benign way so that even if the benevolent superpower oxymoron is true, there's a little more adaptability and a little more positivity associated with dealing with China?
Well, I think there's no question that the U.S. has a lot of soft power. I mean, if you ask the brightest young people in any corner of the world, in Latin America, in Africa, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, and even in East Asia, if you're bright, young, ambitious, which country do you want to go to and where can you make this become enormously successful? You can't do that in China. I mean, Brazilian, Nigerian, Indonesian very rarely can succeed in China. But you can succeed in United States. In Exhibit A, it's people like Elon Musk, Satya Nadella, Sundar Pichai, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, the United States has real soft power in terms of attracting the brightest and the best to come to the United States. But you got to make soft power has got to be dissected, okay? In the past, United States had a lot of soft power with the mass populations and also with the governments of the world. Most governments of the world, in one way, especially during the Cold War, and I can say this because I worked very, very closely with American diplomats in the Cold War. Government-to-government relations were also very close. You could trust the United States, and the United States would always try to listen to you and deal with you and understand your concerns and all that. The height of that I saw when Mr. Lee Kuan Yew went to the United States in 1985 and gave a speech at the joint session of U.S. Congress saying, "Thank you, United States, for creating a rules-based order whereby you guarantee us that small states can grow and thrive and do well," right? So they had soft power with individuals and soft power with governments. And I would say the soft power with individuals still remains. People still believe, still dream of going to the United States to live and work in. But I would say the soft power with governments is at an all-time low. Because especially, and this is where Donald Trump is going to do the biggest amount of damage, because Donald Trump's message to every country is, I don't care what you've done for me in the past. That's irrelevant to me. What have you done for me lately? And also, in a more fundamental way, the rules that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew praised United States for creating, one of the rules is you respect the territorial integrity of sovereign states. Trump is overthrowing. He's telling Panama, your canal belongs to me. He's telling Denmark, Greenland belongs to me. Now, I can tell you that every government around the world is asking, what happens if Trump comes and says, I want a slice of this from you? How are you going to tell him no, right? And he's doing this not to erstwhile adversaries of the United States. I mean, if he was doing this to North Korea or Iran, you can understand this. I can't think of two countries that revere the United States as much as the Canadian and Danish governments would have been the two governments that would have revered the United States. Now, the United States basically is saying, excuse me, you bend to my will, right? And just imagine if China did the same thing with the Philippines, there would be this huge uproar in the Anglo-Saxon media. But the U.S. is doing it.